Okay guys, welcome back to the channel. Got a somewhat controversial video today because we're talking about cables. And I normally don't talk about this topic on the public channel. I do have some videos in the private membership section, and occasionally we'll talk about it in our WhatsApp group. But it's not as bad as you think from the standpoint of if you look at forums and various videos and some strong personalities, how polarizing it gets in terms of the primitive arguments of cables never make a difference or cables always make a difference, subjective, objective, blind testing, all this kind of arguments, measurements and stuff that really end up being more primitive, in my opinion, and based on insecurity in both camps than what is reality. And those of us who have been in the hobby a long time and tried a bunch of different things, most of us have a live and let live philosophy, at least I do. But we also tend to roll our eyes at these polar arguments that are mainly done nowadays for troll purposes or clickbait, if you see it in YouTube or something like that. But the unfortunate part, and that's why I'm talking about this today, because it's also instigated by a project I'm working on with a friend, that sometimes the issues with cables get overlooked in the hogwash of these subjective, objective arguments and the extremes. And just to give my opinion again on the extremes is that really both sides, I think, are coming from an attitude of insecurity with their position. Number one, if you are worried about people spending a lot of money on cables, I mean, it's not your money, number one. Number two, even if it's all in their head, subjective, not provable in a blind test, if they're happy with it and, you know, perception is sometimes reality, or they just like it for aesthetics, again, it's their money. Why care what they're doing? On the flip side, if you've got this expensive cables and you look down on somebody that uses the stock cables or, you know, doesn't spend a lot of money in that area, that's often not a smart move either, because can you pass a blind test to actually prove that what you hear is true and it will apply to them as well? A lot of times, even in the realm of all the people that believe in cables, they can't even agree on a certain brand or when certain cables work better than others and what's the most important cable. You see these sometimes primitive videos on YouTube where even they'll do A/B music clips, but nobody ever agrees, even if they hear the difference between the two, what the difference is. So, you know, it's pointless to, in my opinion, argue on that primitive level. But in that hogwash, what gets overlooked sometimes is there are applications where knowing about the cable interface and applying certain criteria and expertise does make a difference, not only in sound quality, but more importantly in reliability and optimal performance. So I'm going to talk today about a particular project I'm working on which instigated this, but also for those that don't know my history, I think I might have talked about this in a prior video, I can't even recall, but I do have a lot of experience with cables, 30 plus years being in a hobby, actually probably close to 40 now. In fact, I got some here to show you. I think I showed this before, but how many people know what this power cable is? Came with a 100-page instruction manual back in the 90s. This is not a ferrite. This is a resonance controller device. There's also another resonance controller here. Again, 100-page instruction manual. Who knows what these are, what this is? So I had experience with this. And another one I pulled out, I have experience with, even before Nordos was a company, I had these cables, ribbon conductors, actually straight wire, music ribbon. I've had these forever. So I've had Purist Audio Dominus cables that were the most expensive of the day, power cables and whatnot. I'm even using some expensive cables right now in acoustic and have tried other ones. So I'm a live and let live guy. I've tried it all. I've done different things. Oh, I also, for the things I'm using right now, to give you a synopsis of that, I think I've talked about it before, but I'm using Charles Kiermu's speaker cable. Many people don't know him for his record restoration system, but he makes cables that I found really aesthetically and performance-wise. They're very similar to the Kimber 8TCs, and also Danny Ritchie in the last year or two came out with a cable design that was very similar as well to the Kimber and the Kiermus one. So just to give you that flavor. And in signal cables, what I've mainly used in the past, unfortunately this company ever since COVID has taken hiatus, hadn't come back, but I think I've talked about it before. It's a company called River Cables. And what I found important in my journey in cables is that when I tried the expensive ones, I wasn't always getting that reward of the expense yielding that level of performance. But one thing that I started to put more attention to was learning the interface, the things about the measurements and when certain cables and measurements apply, when they don't apply. And what I liked about this company, River Cables, is with every cable they sent you, after they terminated it and at the length, they would then quality control measure it and give you a birth certificate of the measurement applicable to that cable. In some cases, it's going to be a different measurement for speaker cables versus, I think I got here, a digital cable. To me, this was more high-end than a fancy box. This gave me more comfort that they put some effort in quality control and cared about certain things that could be important in the sound quality or performance and reliability of my gear. We often have power cables or charging cables on your phone. And how many times have you plugged in a charging cable on your phone and sometimes it says slow charging because the interface isn't really that great? You wiggle it a little more, all of a sudden, then it's fast charging. Or you change the cable and it's a better cable and you get fast charging. We don't get that feedback from our gear. So it doesn't mean that all the time cables make a difference, but the interface, quality control, and things, reliability and stuff, these are things that you should pay attention to because they can make a difference. And I'll even tell you about some anecdotal stories, even separate from this one story I'm about to tell you that instigated this video. In the past, I had a friend that had great gear, Parasound JC1 amps, awesome DAC at the time, and he was using a passive preamp section. But when I went over to listen to it, it didn't sound right. And he was saying, why isn't this sounding good? It's a great gear. But then we looked at his cable run. It was RCAs, and it was probably well over 30 feet across the room. And then when I looked at his preamp, it was a passive preamp with no buffered outputs. So, and then the JC1s from Parasound weren't super friendly with their input impedance. So the equation there, even though it's great gear, and the cable brand was, an Audiophile cable brand, but they kind of had high capacitance, higher than most brands did. So when you got to that super long run, the capacitance built up, and it made that cable not work at all well with that gear. We didn't have another cable of that length to swap out with lower capacitance. That could have worked as well, but what we did was we put an active preamp with buffered outputs. It drove that cable better, and all of a sudden, that was a night and day difference. Anybody could have passed a 10 out of 10 blind test with that difference alone. That's just one example. Another example, even outside of the normal capacitance, inductance, resistance measurements that may apply in a circuit to, like I just mentioned, sometimes shielding makes a big difference. In one case, I even filmed this house, and I have a video on it, but I don't have this part of the video. But what happened was when we were hooking up the turntable, the phono cable, which was a $600 Audiophile cable, with all this shielding according to the website, but it was picking up a hum from the LED lights in the stand. All we did was switch to another Audiophile brand cable, around the same cost, I think, or even cheaper maybe. The hum was gone. So again, A, B, 10 out of 10 blind tests. It was so easy to tell the difference between these cables. So shielding and some of these measurement parameters within a circuit do make a difference. And even further, from a reliability standpoint, many people may not recall Garrett's cable. It's a speaker cable. It's kind of a sandwich flat conductor, which went for super low inductance, which at the time everybody was touting, you want the lowest inductance possible with your speaker cable. But again, that's a primitive way of looking at things, because what happened was that got so low in inductance, it's an inverse relationship to capacitance. So they went so low with inductance that capacitance got so high, it caused a problem for many amplifiers, and they had to sell these Zobel networks, or the amps had to, and I think even amp manufacturers started redesigning things for this kind of scenario to occur, because so many amps were blowing because of these types of cables that came out. So it's not a case of one dogma or one extreme always being right or wrong. You want to kind of stay out of those polar extremes, because those are just based out of insecurity and primitive arguments. There are situations where it will make a difference. Some situations won't make a difference. You need to understand that to get to that next level of audiophile and sophistication, in my opinion. And what I'm talking about here, I'll tell you the nuances of this specific situation, because again, all of these situations I'm telling you about may apply to you, and you may not have thought of these things. And if you don't have this experience, that's fine. A lot of people don't. I had to kind of teach myself, and I'm still not a total expert, but what I did in this case with my friend, I called the people that I know that have more experience than me. And it ended up being a month worth of talking to experts and getting a variety of opinions. So what you want to do is not just take the word of cable maker who wants to sell you stuff. You want to talk to the brand of the gear you're connecting, talk to some experts that know how to understand. Make sure you're looking at cable brands that do give you enough information, either measurements or stuff that will apply to niche situations. Because for this specific situation I'm talking about, it's a little more challenging than most. I mean, if you're normally doing cable runs under 3 or 4 meters, you probably don't have as many of these challenges that I'm talking about. But in this case, we're talking about a gentleman who has a new home, and he's bringing his MBL Extremes and his MBL amps here, but he wants them on totally separate parts of the room. So we're talking about over 60-foot runs of cables, and he wants all the power delivery to be on the same circuit, the same sub panel that we're putting in with Rex. By the way, Rex is in my WhatsApp group. He has his own grain-oriented wire. So, and then we have some people in my WhatsApp group who have beer budget wire. You know, there's a lot of extremes here. People at least in my group, are live and let live, and I think most people as well out there are the same. So people can cohabitate without being in those extremes, just as a quick aside. But getting back to this scenario, we're talking about 60-foot runs where power lines are going to be run to the new outlets to power the base towers 60 feet across from gear that is also on that same sub panel. And originally what they were going to do is run the power lines and the XLRs to the sub towers and the speaker cables to the main towers of the MBL Extremes, which are actually 4 sets of 2 pairs on each side, 4 pairs total. Through one little channel of these beams going through the ceiling. And the beam was only about 6 to 8 inches wide. And I was like, cut that right there. First of all, it's just running 60 feet of cable. You need to start looking at the electrical parameters, make sure that cable you're using doesn't add up to a high capacitance load or something that will make either side unfriendly of the gear you're connecting. But even more importantly, when you're running power lines parallel to signal cables, that's a little bit sketchy there. You never want to run power, especially, usually in general, you don't want to run too many things parallel, but you don't want to run power lines parallel to your signal cables for especially that long of a run. As it is, that long a run, they tend to turn into more of antennas, potentially. So again, I nixed that, and then we decided to run the power through the ceiling and then cut channels in the floor, one for the XLR, one for the speaker cables. Now the power cables they're going to be so separated, won't be a problem. But even after that, navigating that nuance, we had other things. The XLRs to the base towers. Do you do XLR or RCAs? That was the first thing. Normally, long length XLRs are preferable. Then, even among XLRs, do you shield them or do you use unshielded XLRs? When you're running, again, long distances, shielding usually adds capacitance to a cable. But you typically want lower capacitance for best performance of a cable. In the case of running it to a sub-tower, though, any roll-off or qualitative performance things of that extra capacitance is more than offset by the fact that you're just sending the signal to base towers. So roll-off really could arguably almost help you, but the shielding is, in that equation, is better to have than not have. In another scenario, you may want unshielded XLRs if you're running it to main tower speakers and the capacitance may be a problem at the length you're driving it. These are things, again, you don't need to know yourself, but think about them and at least know that I need to get an expert to kind of help me out, or at least a third party to confirm. Same thing with the speaker cables, looking at the resistance, how much power these towers are going to demand. and running them parallel or separating from the other conductors. That's certain things that you want to really look at and make sure is addressed. And in this case, one of the biggest snafus for the whole project is that it needed to be UL listed, which took out almost every audiophile brand on the planet, because for whatever reason, audiophile brands charging 5 figures or more for cables don't want to pay to get UL listing on their cables. I'll let you guys decide whether that's a red flag for you or not. But for this gentleman and the contractor says his liability insurance tells he can only install things that are UL listed if it's going to be run in wall and and stuff like that. So he didn't want to even risk it or even play in the gray area. The homeowner has a homeowner policy, very big homeowner policy. It's a beautiful home. Didn't want to risk running anything that wasn't UL listed in the thing. So I was handicapped of what could I recommend to him in the audiophile realm that was UL listed even. So again, a lot of these equations may apply to you, may not apply to you, but I wanted to share something a little more sophisticated than just the typical subjective arguments and qualitative things that normally degenerate into just name calling and primitive arguments, typically what you see online and in YouTube videos. So hopefully you found this helpful. If so, sign up, subscribe, because I'll see you back here soon with a lot more.